What's a stakeholder? We have literally been talking about stakeholders all during this class so far. And today we're actually going to think about our stakeholders in a much more meaningful and deeper way. I like to call it a strategic way of thinking about stakeholders. So let's get things started. We're going to do a stakeholder mapping exercise today that is directly related to crisis communication. So what is a stakeholder? You'll notice it's not S-T-E-A-K. It's not like we're going to eat a steak sandwich. It's a stake. And the idea is that a stakeholder is somebody who has a stake. They have a valid reason or some type of involvement with your organization. It's also different than a shareholder. Shareholder implies that they own shares in your company. So hopefully that kind of distinguishes between those terms. Lots of people get those mixed up. And it's really anyone that is affected by or affects that focal organization. We have two different kinds of stakeholders. A primary stakeholder are those who are directly affected or directly affect an organization, and you can probably think of a lot of examples of those, like employees, suppliers, the government. And then we have secondary stakeholders. Those are people who are more indirectly affected. And I shared a few examples here, like the media, activist organizations, and even your competitors are a type of secondary stakeholder. But you know what? Just talking about a primary and a secondary stakeholder is not enough, because the whole reason you do stakeholder mapping is to think really deeply about everyone you could possibly affect or who could affect you. So the model we're going to focus on is by some researchers, Mitchell, Agel, and Woods, who had come up with this model in 1997, so it's been around a long time, but it has absolutely been used for a lot of fantastic purposes. And it thinks about stakeholders in terms of their salience or kind of relevance to an organization. It also has a great body of literature around ethical responsibilities of organizations. And whereas we won't go into that type of stakeholder theory and salience model today, what we will focus on is how to better understand the risk that an organization might face from their stakeholders so that they can better create plans and get prepared. What we'll do next is we'll do an interactive exercise, and you'll actually get to see me walk you through thinking about this stakeholder salience model. I hope you enjoy it, and I hope you learn a whole lot. Let's assume that we are all a part of a nonprofit organization. Let's just call it the Stevens Classes Flooding Nonprofit. Our mission is to raise funds and try to support lower income communities in the greater Houston area who have seen repetitive flooding losses. Now, having an example like that to think through what we're going to do here, which is called stakeholder mapping, gives us a lot of concrete examples of how to think through what a stakeholder is and why they might matter. So the first group of stakeholders I want you to think about are the ones who have a completely legitimate reason to interact with us. We probably know them really well. They're called our legitimate stakeholders. So one of the groups that we might want to get involved in our nonprofit are other nonprofits who serve vulnerable communities in Houston. So all right, nonprofit right there, okay? They have legitimate concerns. The next characteristic of stakeholders I want you to think about is called power. Now, power has to do with political power, but it's a lot more than that. These are the visible stakeholders in the community, and they have sometimes this influence over our nonprofit that we may like and we may just have to conform to. So a good example of that is a government stakeholder. Okay, so that's our power. So our third characteristic of our stakeholders is called urgency or willingness. And these are people who want to speak up about issues. And so a good example of that might be a friend of someone who just experienced repetitive flooding in Houston. And they're telling everybody, hey, we need to help these groups. Okay, so I'll write friend right there. So now we have our three characteristics. Where this really starts to get interesting is when these characteristics overlap. And the first group that I want to talk about is this one right here. These are our powerful stakeholders who also have very legitimate reasons to interact and be involved with us. These can be great allies to our nonprofit. And I'll tell you a great example of who might fit in that category is the county judge in Harris County, Lena Hidalgo. We'll just assume we know her on a first name basis and put Lena up there. So Lena has power. She's very visible in the community. She also advocates for her community on a regular basis because she lives there. So she has a legitimate concern as well. The next area of overlap is this one right here. Okay, so these are our stakeholders who are involved, affected, have a legitimate concern. They also have some type of a sense of urgency. And a good example there would be our stakeholders who, maybe there's a group that represents the renters in this area who are experiencing this repetitive flooding. We'll call it our renter group. Okay. Now I'm actually going to change pen color because this third area deserves the closest color that I have to red. Right here, okay? These people are most often overlooked. They're called dangerous stakeholders in some of the stakeholder models out there, and the reason is that on the surface, they don't have any legitimate reason to be either working for or against our nonprofit, and they often come out of the blue. They're actually quite often going to be using social media to expose something they don't like about an organization, and that's why they're called dangerous stakeholders. So in our example, let's assume that there is an economic development group in Houston, and in some situations, they would be really great to partner with. But this particular economic development group has heard about our nonprofit. They're extremely concerned that if we are raising funds for a low-income neighborhood that's experiencing repetitive flooding, it's going to raise everybody's insurance rates for flood insurance in Houston. Well, it's kind of a legitimate concern. It could happen, right? But if we didn't think about this ahead of time, we could be in a lot of trouble. So we're going to call this our Econ Development Group. Imagine, though, if before we got in the middle of this crisis and had to respond to this economic development group, that we had thought through all of our different stakeholders, done an extensive mapping, met as a team and said, who has legitimacy, power, urgency? Where are these interactions? And we anticipated that we might have some of these dangerous stakeholders. Maybe we reach out ahead of time. We tell them what our agenda is. Those can be really great proactive steps to involve all these different types of stakeholders. Now, the final set of stakeholders, right in the center, these are called pretty much our definitive stakeholders. And what's really nice about this group is they have those legitimate concerns. They also have some power, maybe visibility, and they also have some urgency to their claims. And so they would be great people to get on board at our nonprofit right from the very beginning. I hope you found this little exercise that we just went through helpful. And Maybe the next time you are faced with thinking through different types of stakeholders that might be involved, you'll take it that next step and think about the interactions between a model that was developed by Mitchell, Agel, and Woods and has been around for a long time. A lot of times it also has ethical implications and is used for very meaningful work. I hope you found that a helpful example. If you're curious about the original resources that developed this model, I have some references for you. And I hope you're all ready to go map some stakeholders as we continue using this kind of practice throughout the rest of the course.